I hate nationalism of any kind. I feel absolutely nothing when I see the Union Jack, he said, except repulsion, which isn't exactly nothing. He says, I don't feel Irish either. I'm Mancunian Irish. So there what you have is that hybridity. I'm Manchester Irish, I'm Mancunian Irish. I'm not one thing or the other, I'm both. Now these remarks bring me to the final case study, which as I say is on the Smiths. And there's a picture of Morrissey in 1984, surrounded by the works of Oscar Wilde, which might have been a clue to his affiliation with Irishness. Now, I discussed all of these issues with Johnny Marr, the Smiths guitarist, after Morrissey politely declined an interview. And Marr talked about the experience of growing up in an Irish family in England. And he said for him, that experience had a great deal of what he calls schizophrenia. And by schizophrenia, I think he means, I take that to mean ambivalence, which is to say this. So this is what he said. He said, I had this schizophrenic kind of upbringing. My family had an overtly pro-Mancunian sensibility, and they taught me to be aware of all the advantages and opportunities of being brought up in England. So his parents are very young, from Athy in County Kildare. They're in Manchester in the early 60s. They're extremely young, in their late teens or 20s, and they're excited to be in England. England is an exciting place. It's a place of opportunity and adventure. And they tell the young Johnny, you know, this is an interesting, exciting place to be. But at the same time, he says, the household was what he calls a super Irish environment. Decorated in harps, shamrocks, ornaments inscribed with the word era, Irish tricolours, Sacred Heart images. So he describes his house as super Catholic and super Irish. So on the one hand, his parents are saying, it's really exciting to be in England, make the most of all these opportunities, and at the same time, Ireland is being evoked all of the time as an absent home. So this is what he calls his schizophrenia, ambivalence, being pulled in two directions at once. There's that famous Smith song, this way and that way, this way and that way. And in a way, that's what Marr's talking about, being pulled this way and that way, this way and that way. So while Marr would learn from his parents to be very pro-Manchester and to appreciate the opportunities of post-war England, he was always immersed in Irish culture, particularly through his parents' home, through Irish music and the Irish Catholic symbols of his environment. In this context, Marr talks about the repulsion he felt towards British nationalism as a youth. He says he never felt an affinity with the Union Jack. I've always hated that flag, he said. He sees it as a sign of aggression towards immigrants, including the Irish. At the same time, though, Marr says he had little time for what he calls the hokey romanticism expressed by sections of the Irish in Manchester. This thing about idealising Ireland, he was also uncomfortable with. What he grows up feeling then is a kind of ambivalence. He doesn't feel fully Irish, but he doesn't feel fully English either. He said, I was never quite the definite article. He refers to the second generation Irish in Manchester as a floating generation. We're on our own, he suggests, between Ireland and England, floating. The Isle of Man, perhaps, is the natural home for these people who feel somewhere between Ireland and England. Now, Marr suggests that this feeling of ambivalence informed the Smiths' work. He says, yes, that feeling of ambivalence is there without a doubt. In this context, he points to the mixture of vibrancy and melancholy that was part of the musical culture in which he was raised. He talks about the Irish music and other kinds of music, country music and pop music, in his parents' home, which was full of music, and talks about the mixture of vibrancy and excitement, but also melancholy, and these things coexisting. He was particularly fond of the song The Black Velvet Band, which one of his aunts would sing all the time. And he explains that the reason why so many Smith songs are in waltz time is because he wanted to acknowledge the black. Very, very few indie rock songs from the 1980s are in 3/4 time, or 6/8 time, in waltz time. But the reason is he wanted to acknowledge that song as part of his childhood, the Black Velvet Band, which he really loved as a child. So what Marr suggests to me in his interview is that rather than trying to replicate the sound of Irish Manchester in the 60s, in the Smiths music, what he wanted to capture was its mood, was its atmosphere. And he says this very deliberately. He set out to try and evoke the atmosphere and ambience of what it felt like to be in the Irish community in Manchester in the 60s and 70s. Didn't want to replicate what it sounded like. He didn't want to perform Irish music. He wasn't interested in that. But he did want to capture that mood. And he says this, there are certain things in the Smiths music that nail that emotional place and that evocative time for me. The best example of it is the song Please, 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 Let Me Get What I Want, which is, so there's a blue album there, The Smiths' Hatful of Hollow. It's the final track. And if you go to your local record shop, which you should do because they're all dying out, and try and get a vinyl copy of Hatful of Hollow, pull out the record, and the song Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want is the final song on side 2. And Marr wrote that song, wrote the music for that song, and called it the Irish Waltz. Okay? And then he gave that song to Morrissey, and Morrissey put the words on it, and it became Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want. And he wrote it as a sort of letter to his mother. He was in London, missing his home in Manchester, missing the Irish community in Manchester, and he wanted to acknowledge them. So he wrote this song called the Irish Waltz. And as you listen to the final, and I'll play it now, as you listen to the final section of that song, look at the run-off groove. Remember what a run-off groove is? At the end of your record, there's a little black strip just before the label, and the Smiths would always leave messages in there, various little comments and political references. And at the end of that, the word era appears, apropos of nothing. And Marr said he put that in there as an oblique reference to the band's origins. All 4 members of the band came from Irish backgrounds in Manchester. So it's a kind of an oblique, it's not explicit in the way MacGowan is, but it's a sort of subtle reference. So I know we're coming towards a conclusion here, so I'll just play a very short section of this track. So this is the song that was called the Irish Waltz. And this is a song that Marr says tried to capture the atmosphere of Irish Manchester in the 1960s, so you can see what you think. So play this now. Okay, we can maybe talk about that in questions. So I'm going to conclude now because I know we're running out of time here. I've talked about Marr a little bit. Let me just give you a quick quote from Morrissey in terms of this. Morrissey wrote this song in 1985 with the Smiths called Never Have No One Ever, and the kind of opening line is, when you walk without ease on these streets where you were raised. And Morrissey was asked in 1960 to say, what does that mean, when you walk without ease on these streets where you were raised? And Morrissey said this: it was the frustration I felt at the age of 20 when I didn't feel easy walking around the streets on which I'd been born, where all my family had lived. They're originally from Ireland but had been here since the 50s. It was a constant confusion to me why I never really felt, this is my patch, this is my home. I know these people, I can do what I like because this is mine. It never was, says Morrissey, I could never walk easily. So there's a sense in which Morrissey feels not at ease in England, in a certain way. So his lyrics are trying to evoke the marginality of what it meant, what it felt like growing up as a second-generation Irish kid in Manchester, while Marr's music is trying to evoke the mood of Irish Manchester in the 1960s. So it's there in the Smiths, but it's there in a quite a complex, subtle way. Now, I think these comments by Morrissey are reminiscent of other second-generation Irish figures. There's a novelist called Brian Keane, and he wrote a series of short stories in the 1980s, and he explained them in this way. He said, as a boy, I felt not entirely at ease with either my Irish parents or my English companions. I think this is something that a lot of children of immigrants feel. So there is this thing that emerges amongst the second generation, that they feel uneasily placed between Irishness and Englishness. And that can be a kind of a burden, because that's a difficult thing to deal with. But it's also, and I want to finish on a positive note, it's also been a creative wellspring. They see it as a very positive thing, as being a very creative thing. So I'm going to finish with a quote from Martin McDonagh, which I'm not sure if you can see. But again, he's asked, okay, Martin, you're London Irish, but what are you really? Are you Irish or are you English? And Martin McDonagh says this: I always felt somewhere kind of in between Irish and English. I felt half and half and neither, which is good. I'm happy having a foot in both camps. I'm not into any kind of definition, any kind of ism, politically, socially, religiously. It's not that I don't think about that stuff, says McDonough, but I've come to a place where the ambiguities are more interesting than choosing a strict path and following it. So I'll finish on that point.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Sean. Very enlightening talk about 3 bands, and just makes you think differently about actually what it was that they were singing about. So we're going to take a 15-minute break now, just so everybody can re-energise themselves, and then Sean will come back and answer some questions. That's okay. Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you.